Good evening, everybody, and welcome to a little more somber edition of Pulse of the Pack. The Packers have lost for the first time in a little over a month. They fall today to the Los Angeles Chargers by a final score of 26-11, which is an odd point total, but that's kind of how things went today for your Green Bay Packers in Los Angeles. I am your host this evening. I am Jacob Westendorf, and joined with me, of course, as always, is Jason Perone. And Jason, we are a few days away from you making your trip back to the Holy Lands.
I am. So that's giving me a little bit of solace after the game that was today against the Chargers. I will be making the trek to Wisconsin and Lambeau Field next weekend for the Carolina Panthers, which will be the first cold weather game of the year at Lambeau Field. So thrilled to be a part of that.
Yeah, looking anywhere between like 32 and 34 degrees, depends on the day. As far as the forecast goes, maybe we'll get a little bit of snow in regards to that as well. But before we get to Carolina, we got to go through, unfortunately, this nonsense. And that's really all I can call it. The first half, it really just kind of felt like one of those games like death by 1,000 paper cuts for the first half. The Chargers, they move up and down the field, but the defense is able to hold them to field goals. They make a couple plays in terms of Zadarius Smith, Preston Smith, both end up with a sack in the first half. But offense, I, I mean, what can you say? There's nothing doing. There was nothing going on today for the Packers on offense. They went 3-and-out. If they didn't go 3-and-out, then penalties killed their drive. Take me through, Jason, just a little bit of your frustrations with watching. I mean, honestly, the Chargers, and we'll get to it. The Chargers did make some plays, and they deserve some credit. But that being said, the self-inflicted wounds really killed the chances that the Packers had to get anything going on offense today.
Yeah, it was just a bad game all around. Every facet of the game was bad by Green Bay. It was like the talk about them being jet lagged, valid. When everything goes wrong like that, it's you just kind of fold it up and you look ahead to the following week and you call it a clunker, because that's exactly what it was. It's different when the defense is playing great and holding Los Angeles to field goals, and the offense is driving and they're about to win the game, and then they fumble for the fourth time. Those are the kind of things that frustrate us, and that's more what we're used to seeing is just weird stuff. The Packers are usually in close games. It's rare that they're ever out of it from the get-go, but that just seemed like that was the case in this game. So offense wasn't great. Aaron Rodgers came on a little bit at the end, but passing game couldn't get going. The Chargers pass rush was in Rodgers' face all day. The obvious thing, Matt LaFleur said it this week, Joey Bosa and Melvin Ingram can wreck a game. They came into this game knowing that was the case, and those two still wrecked the game. Sure, they're good. They're Pro Bowl players. They're all pro players, but you still have to have an answer, and the Packers just did not have answers. And the mistakes on defense, again, some tackling woes, the mistakes on offense, the absolutely atrocious play on special teams today. The only thing you can say about it is it all happened in one game. And if they come out next week and they return to form and they play well, you throw this one in the trash, you burn the tape, and you never watch it again.
Yeah, and I don't know what there is. I don't know if there is much, if anything, to be gleaned from the tape of this game, because the Packers were just so bad. And I thought the Chargers did some good things. They can muddy up some games. I thought they did well at some things. You mentioned Bosa and Ingram wrecking the game. The Packers have had a lot of success this year in terms of putting their two tackles on an island and saying erase these guys from the game. And for the most part, Brian Bulaga has definitely been up to that task this season. And David Bakhtiari, maybe not as much. He certainly hasn't been the elite player that we've become accustomed to him being. But for the most part, he's at least been pretty good, and they were not up to that challenge today. Elton Jenkins struggled. Really everybody across the front took turns struggling today. The biggest issue, and Matt LaFleur kind of talked about it in his post-game presser, was that the Packers were so unable, and you kind of saw this early in the season, when they were unable to get in a rhythm offensively. And LaFleur's offense is very good when it can stack plays together and make some plays look like other plays that we just ran previously in the game. And all that sort of stuff. And you can't really do that if you're going 3-0 or, having to be in 2nd and 20s because you have a holding penalty, or 2nd and 15 because you have a false start penalty. The Packers false started, I believe, 3 times early in the game. And this wasn't a hostile road environment. The whole game just didn't make sense to me because it was essentially a home game. The Packers are the better team. I don't think there's any question about that. They had been playing good football. They're coming off of a big win. LaFleur said it coming out of halftime that it just looked like a team that was playing tired, and they got to the stadium late and all that stuff. And Rodgers, after the game, basically said, those are all excuses, and they are what they are. They just didn't play well. And Rodgers said that he felt the focus wasn't there from the start. So he said maybe a slice of humble pie would be something to help them. And something we learned, Jason, the Packers started 3-0. They lost to Philadelphia, and they made some adjustments. They lost to Philadelphia and lost their best receiver in the process. And then they kind of went on this run through October where they ran roughshod through everybody for a little while and end up at 7-1, 4-0 without Devontae Adams. And they adjusted really well to having lost a game. Now, this isn't the same. All games and losses and all wins are not created equal. But in this case, the Packers do need to respond because, as my colleague and publisher at Packer Report put it, Ross Uglum, said, Sunday's game against Carolina is a big deal now because go 8-2 into the bye, you're feeling pretty good. Go 7-3, and the quote-unquote wheels are coming off, and you're going into a big road contest off the bye against San Francisco. And we'll get to that later. But Rodgers talked about this, the leadership needing to respond. How confident are you in this team responding to the adversity that they're facing now of really, this is the worst game they've played all season?
Well, I don't have any reason to think that they can't because they've only lost 2 games so far. And the last time they lost a game, they came back and won, and they played well, and they put a string of victories together. They beat the Cowboys on the road. So that was definitely facing adversity and stepping up, if you ask me. So they've done it before. I think today was not a typical Packers game where there was issues where there's a lot to be concerned about. There was just, I don't want to make excuses. They played poorly and it wasn't fun to watch, but you had everything going wrong and they just didn't seem like they got off the plane ready to play a football game. It's not a good look, but it's also not something that I think is going to carry over. Like I said, there wasn't one major issue that kept rearing its ugly head that kept everything else that was good from happening. It was just a bunch of bad. So I think they're at home. So I think the leadership on this team has come through time and time again with what they've said and the culture that they've created. Now, hey, they could very well come out next week, struggle and lose a game at home. And then it's a problem because you've lost 2 in a row. You lose 1 at home. Have teams figured out how to play this against the Packers, and if the rush can get home with 4, it's the same thing. I mean, we saw this happen to Packers teams in the past. I keep thinking of that playoff game against the Giants after 2011 when all they had to do was send 4, and all the things that had been working all season long and offensively churning suddenly weren't working, and the Packers couldn't get the offense going. They kept turning the ball over, and their season's over. So we're not at that point yet. I mean, come on. I mean, 7 victories is nothing to scoff at, but they definitely need to bounce back here. Now, on the flip side, next week's game is important. It wasn't going to not be important because anytime you're playing against a team for the only time in a season, you need to win, because if you're going to face that team later, the head-to-head tiebreaker is one of the biggest things that's going to factor into whether or not you're playing at home or on the road. But on the flip side too, you beat a team like Carolina coming off of this Chargers game, and everybody forgets about the Chargers game. They go into the bye and they come out of it with some mojo, and they're ready to go against a really tough road game against the Niners. So I'm inclined to give the benefit of the doubt right now, and that's coming from me, somebody who doesn't tend to do that very often, especially on game day when they're playing the way they did today. But like I said before we started recording, you don't ever want to lose a game. But if they're going to lose a game, I think this is maybe the way that I prefer that they do it, where it's like just play badly and get it all out of your system. Now, obviously, you can't keep doing that. You have to respond and show up and play well the next week. But if there's a way to lose a game, I think today was kind of it, where it's just like, okay, they just didn't show up. You know what I mean? So I'm inclined to think that next week could be very different.
Yeah, and that part is frustrating in the fact that you say they didn't show up. And I mean, it makes you wonder what were they doing. They got into LA obviously a little bit earlier. There's a lot more to do in LA than there is in Green Bay, so maybe that was part of it. I'm not making any accusations. I have no idea if that's the case or not, but there was that. The Packers have played well, a lot of press, a lot of, and Rodgers even said it himself that this team could use a slice of humble pie, perhaps, and that's something that they can look at. So hopefully that's the case. If you want a silver lining, I guess, everybody else in the NFC North lost today, so the Packers didn't lose any ground. The other way to look at it, obviously, is that they lost an opportunity to give themselves some distance between themselves and Minnesota. And I mean, at the end of the year, and I've been kind of having this circled on my calendar, just looking ahead, is you don't want that Vikings game, that Monday night Vikings game in that stadium where you've never won, to be a game that decides whether or not you're going to win the division, get a bye, anything like that, just because it's a tough place to play. Winning division games is tough. Winning division games on the road is even tougher. The Packers, before this year against Chicago, they hadn't won a division road game in a little while. They haven't won in Detroit in quite some time. They haven't won in Minnesota in a long time, obviously since they played at the old Humpty Dump. So that's something that could be looked at as a missed opportunity. Today, the narrative-based analysis is something to me that's frustrating, just because I think that people point to the low-hanging fruit. And the low-hanging fruit is, okay, Davante Adams is back. The offense doesn't play well. Packers don't add anybody at the trade deadline, so they don't add any receivers. The offense doesn't play well. So what are the two things that people point to the most? Well, the Packers offense didn't play well with Davante Adams. Are they better without him? And the other one was, well, they need another receiver because none of the other guys were able to do anything today. And I've been vocal about their needs at receiver. That being said, I think that using today's game as a basis to fit your opinion is, I often talk about, people come to the conclusions that they want to come to. And that's a conclusion I think that you wanted to come to. Using this game as anything other than, I kind of made the joke of Davante's back as the offense works with him. Like, Davante being back or not doesn't block Joey Bosa and Melvin Ingram. Another receiver doesn't block Joey Bosa or Melvin Ingram. Really, and I'm not saying the Packers need new offensive tackles or anything like that. They just needed their offensive tackles to play better, and they didn't. That's really the biggest thing. And when you talk about pass rushers ruining a game, we've seen it. Za'Darius and Preston Smith have done it to several teams throughout the year. So they've got plenty of examples of Green Bay's pass rush doing that. Their pass rush is also paid. And Ingram and Bosa are two of the best players. We talked about that in our game preview. And what it really did, and this is the part that's the most frustrating, is I said going into this game, the Packers' biggest advantage in this game was on the ground. The Chargers' run defense is one of the worst in the NFL. The Packers actually did a pretty good job running the ball today in the minimal opportunities that they had. If you guys will give me a minute, I'll look up the numbers here just real quick. But they didn't have a ton of opportunities. That being said, Jamal Williams ran for 5 yards a carry. Jones ran for just under 4. And had he had more opportunities, I think they had chances to break one. But they couldn't get enough attempts in the game because they were constantly behind the sticks. Or eventually, as we saw in the second half, they fell behind. That being said, Jason, let's just address this Davante thing real quick. 2 words or less. Is this Packers offense worse with Davante Adams?
Nope.
All right, there we go. You guys see that? But I do think one conversation that can be had is just the discussion of looking his direction, or perhaps like Rodgers uses him as a safety blanket a little too much. There was an example where Rodgers threw a smoke screen to Adams, and it looked like Lazard was coming free down the field. And it's almost like, okay, Adams is open, get him the ball. And that's not necessarily the best way to run the offense, if that makes any sense. Perhaps I'm explaining it poorly. But at the same time, it's really hard to criticize the offense's play calling, the way that they played, anything like that, because they just weren't on the field. I mean, they weren't able to string anything together. And that's not the fault of and I see it through the game, and it's so frustrating. The willingness that people have immediately to just, their automatic is blame the coach, blame the play calling, blame this, blame that. Like, Matt LaFleur calling a play and it doesn't matter what play Matt LaFleur calls if Brian Bulaga is beaten in 1.5 seconds. Very simple. When Joey Bosa is able to get around Bulaga in a blink, it does not matter what play Matt LaFleur calls. So I think that is a little too over the top. Talking about Mike Pettin and there are some adjustments I think the Packers could make in terms of playing against the run. But that being said, in general, the Packers, I think, do have a sound strategy in terms of how to play defense. The problem is they may not have the personnel to run that all that well. So we've addressed the passing offense with Adams. Let's talk about the rushing defense while we're at it. I think the biggest problem that they've had is Kenny Clark is a very good player when he's healthy, and it's very clear that I don't think he's healthy right now. And I don't want to pile on the guy, but Blake Martinez has left a lot to be desired. I try not to make that comparison because he's a Caucasian linebacker who wears number 50, but he gets a lot of tackles in the same way A.J. Hawk used to. And he's not a playmaker.
Well, you know what? A.J. Hawk every once in a while made a splash play, got a sack, got an interception. Blake's not even doing that.
No, and he hasn't for quite some. He had early in the year, he had a sack. He's been a pretty good blitzer in the past, but I mean, what can you say at this point? Martinez has played poorly, and not all of them. I mean, there are plays where you could see it with the defensive line as a whole. I think needs a bit of a wake up call. They have not played well in the last month or so. Some of that is because of Kenny Clark's injury, but some of that is guys just very simply not getting off of blocks. And that's really run defense. They give you the BS narrative lines of, it's about want to, it's about desire. It's like guys just are not getting off blocks. It really is that simple. Guy is blocking you. You need to get off that block and make a play. And the Packers are not doing that. Blake Martinez, you need to fill a hole. They are not doing that. He is not doing that. That being said, if the Packers' biggest issue in the future is their run defense, that's not that big of a deal. The biggest issue that the Packers had today was that in addition to the running plays, Packers weren't doing anything to affect the passing game. Phillip Rivers averaged more than 10 yards per pass attempt. That's a lot. And they didn't turn him over. They sacked him a couple times, but they were kind of like empty plays. Zadarius Smith made a play. That was nice and ended up forcing a field goal. But the Chargers, I believe, punted once during the game. That's not going to get it done. They need to start playing better on defense, and the defense really has. Bill Huber made a pretty good point, I thought, on Packers Overtime, the podcast that he does where he says, is Green Bay's defense any good? He says, I don't know. I know they make a lot of big plays. They also give up a lot of big plays. And in addition to giving up a lot of big plays, they don't really make you punt. And, keeping teams off the scoreboard, that matters. And the Packers have done a decent job of that. Ultimately, for the most part, if the Packers offense plays a relatively normal game, today's performance is good enough. But that being said, you need to be more than good enough against a average Chargers team if you're going to play well in the playoffs. So what are your thoughts in general, Jason, I guess, on the run defense right now? Is it a huge deal if that doesn't become at least less Swiss cheese-like?
Yeah, of course, because then you're gonna make teams have to do things, not as they're not going to be as balanced. So if you make it easy for other teams to do the obvious things, then they're going to beat you, and you're going to get beat a lot. That's not any big revelation. So yeah, they have to get better in playing against the run, and they've got to figure it out. We don't know what guys are playing hurt or not hurt. If Blake is, really hampered by the hand injury, he's also got to get put in a position to do what he does best, and it's not cover anybody, and especially not down the field. And he's just not plugging the hole like he used to. They've got to figure that out, that whole thing. Whether it's the trade deadline's over, they can't really add any premium assets to this defense. And we hear about execution again. We all rolled our eyes last year when Mike McCarthy over the years said execution. We just need to execute better. We've seen to execute better. Everyone rolled their eyes. There is something to be said about it. I mean, you do have to play sound football, but they're going to have to find a way to stop the run. because their secondary is also not taking the ball away. They didn't really have a lot of. They had the one takeaway last week, and that was really because the running back, fumbled himself. I know Tyler Lancaster might have put his hand up, but I think that ball was more on the way that Shady was carrying the ball than a play that was made. So it's been a couple weeks since the Packers have made a splash play. I thought Jair Alexander in particular today did not play very well. He got beat. He went for the ball on an early pass play, and then the receiver gets a ton of yards after the catch, and then he misses the interception that would have taken 3 points off the board. Didn't end up being game-changing, and he gets beat deep later in the game. So there's a lot of things on defense that they need to work on, but if you can stop the run, a lot of other good things happen. It's just like, on the flip side on offense, if you can establish the run, your offense opens up and you can do more things and do other things. So they're going to have to get it figured out. I have to trust that even though Kenny Clark might not be 100% healthy, him being out there still is the team saying he's still a better option than not having him out there. So I don't really know if his injury is causing more of the issues or if he's just having a down year. But it's unfortunate in his case if that's what's happening, because he's about to head into the last year of his rookie deal. And there's been a lot of calls for the Packers to extend Clark. And I think that they need to. But right now, the way that he's playing, the team's got a little bit of leverage. So I don't know what that's going to necessarily going to turn into, but they got to get better up front. You got to win up front. The Packers definitely struggled on defense today. And the result was a Chargers team that has not run the ball very well and whose offensive line has not played very well and who had only been averaging less than 40 yards a game for the past 3-4 weeks. That whole trend got reversed today in a hurry. And so the Packers helped the Chargers get healthy.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on. I think there's a lot of small things that are adding up to some big things for Green Bay. And that's one of them. You mentioned Clark not being healthy. Clark not playing that well as a result of it. Blake Martinez not playing that well. Jair Alexander having a bad game. There's just a lot of players that, today, I think it was Peter Bukowski who tweeted, like, the Chargers' best players played well. Bosa, Ingram, Mike Williams, Keenan Allen, Hunter Henry, Melvin Gordon, Phillip Rivers. Those guys all played well. The Packers' best players really didn't. And at the end of the day, more often than not always, but more often than not, if your best players play better than their best players, you're going to win a hell of a lot of football games. And the Packers, they didn't have it today. That's really, I think that, like, we know that every team has a fatal flaw. There's no team is perfect. Even the New England Patriots, who, as we are talking right now, are working on coming out of a 17-0 deficit. They're inside the 10-yard line with about 15 seconds left. But they were 17-0. It's now 17-10. Even the Patriots have flaws. It's just a matter of who does the best at masking those flaws in a playoff and a one-game sample size. And Jason, you say it all the time. It's a lot about matchups. So once the playoffs hit, and that's looking really far ahead, I think that's kind of why last week when we were talking about opportunities for their record at the bye week and all that other nonsense, I kept saying, don't put the cart before the horse, because if you start talking about stuff like that, then you end up even more upset when something like this happens. Now, that being said, us talking about the fact that the Packers could have gone 9-1 before the bye week had nothing to do with them playing piss poor today. That's on them, and that's something they need to correct. I think that in the one bit of adversity that Matt LaFleur has faced, he's found a way to do that. So that'll be interesting to see. Carolina is another team. They match up well with them. We'll talk more about the Panthers later this week, but if you do look ahead, they match up well with the Packers. But the Packers also have some things that they can do well against Carolina also, and it's at Lambeau Field, which is certainly going to help. So at the end of the day, it sucks. That's one giant shitburger that the Packers laid today. But, if you really think about it, Jason, if we did a list of things that went well for Green Bay today, what do we have?
Honestly, if I look at it, Aaron Rodgers came on late. They didn't completely fold up the tent, and J.K. Scott had a couple of nice directional kicks. I'm honestly just trying to grasp at something. There just wasn't much to hang on to today, and that's why it's just like, look, they just didn't bring it today.
No, and they didn't.
Sometimes that happens, Jake, and that's the thing is we're not accustomed to that as Packers fans. We're used to seeing the Packers do that. They're always competitive and they're always in games, and so this is maybe a good time to remind everybody. And I'm not I don't believe in the entitlement, entitled town, and I'm not a fan. I don't believe in that whole thing. I don't think that's a fair thing to throw at Packers fans, that they don't appreciate their team winning. I think when you establish a culture of being a successful organization or team, you adjust your expectations accordingly. And when you get disappointed, you're disappointed. You're not entitled, you're disappointed.
Right.
I think it is a chance for us to remind ourselves and say, hey, look, how many times over the last 10 years, 20 years have we had to deal with a game like this? You can count on one hand and have fingers left over.
Yeah, I remember years ago, I think it was 2012, there was a Sunday night game against the Giants. The Packers got blown out by the Giants. It was like 38-10 or something like that was final. And I remember that was the first game that the Packers had played in the regular season as a loss that wasn't decided by one score or less in almost 3 years or something like that. It was crazy how competitive and how close the Packers had been in those kinds of games. So today sucked. That's really the only way to put it. Now, the biggest thing is, can they bounce back from it? And last year, this time a year ago, we were talking about a loss to the New England Patriots where things had started to snowball. And the Packers are in a better spot. They didn't let the Eagles' loss and Devontae's injury and all that stuff snowball. They played well. They got better. And I think that ultimately today was just a perfect storm of a bad start and a team that wasn't all that focused, and that's according to their quarterback. And at the end of the day, we're getting to the point where it's almost a perfect storm of crap that gets the Packers buried, and that's exactly what happened. So that's going to do it for this edition of the game recap. Be sure to check out the show's Twitter handle. That is at Packer Pulse. You can follow Jason. He's at Jason Perrone. And you can follow me. I am at Jacob Westendorf. Our next show will be live from Green Bay, Wisconsin. We will be there. My wife and I are traveling up on Saturday morning. So we will be there by the mid-afternoon to do our game preview of Packers versus Panthers. And our post-game will also be live from Green Bay at a site to be determined. So if you're going to be in Green Bay, please feel free. We'll let you know where we're going to be those days. Come out, say hi to us. Let's eat, drink, and be merry, as they say. So it should be a lot of fun. Thank you guys for listening. And, of course, as always, bounce back time. Go, Pack, go.